On 30 November 1874, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace, where stone halls, ancestral portraits, and winter light made infancy itself feel staged, as if public life were already waiting in the next room with a script of duty, ambition, and display. This backdrop was crucial, and the traditional confidence of the nobility turned into mere acting, showing the young boy that power endures only by securing public faith amidst shifting times. Above him stood the memory of John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, whose victories had become family scripture, so that military glory appeared not as romance, but as precedent, a living suggestion that a single commander might steady a nation when institutions faltered. Lord Randolph Churchill, his brilliant but aggressively combative and ultimately defeated father, made this reality even harsher. Young Winston witnessed raw talent crash against rigid political systems, quickly realizing that governance is a ruthless battlefield where intellect, status, and charisma can still lead to failure. His mother, Jenny Jerome, brought American wealth, speed, and glamour into the household. Yet her social brilliance was paired with emotional distance, leaving the boy to discover one of history's harsher truths: that admiration can be plentiful, while tenderness remains. The fractured home caused him to observe people intensely, hoarding vocal shifts, insults, and quiet moments like proof, a practice that later infused his speeches with a unique blend of personal connection, unwavering toughness, and dramatic flair. The tenderness he trusted most came from Elizabeth Everest, his nanny, whose steady care gave him a lasting sense of loyalty. And that memory of faithful attachment would matter later, when allies failed, critics circled, and gratitude became one of his fiercest political instincts. Growing up in Ireland during his grandfather's tenure as Viceroy provided a different education. Witnessing uniforms, cavalry mounts, bureaucrats, and protected rituals proved that imperialism wasn't merely a theoretical concept, but an everyday structure of control upheld through grand displays, constant watchfulness, and the underlying threat of violence. School offered no early coronation, for at St. George's and later Harrow, he was often judged difficult, inattentive, and unimpressive. And those humiliations bit deeply, because institutions were measuring him as ordinary, while he already imagined himself in argument with history. Defeat ultimately served as a harsh instructor, as scoldings bred defiance. Close calls built stamina, and letdowns trained him to doubt popular consensus, instilling the risky belief that mainstream views could be incorrect, and that relentless determination could eventually conquer any widespread disrespect. Meanwhile, the household darkened as Lord Randolph's health failed, and when he died in January 1895, Winston felt the blow as grief, shock, and unfinished business at once, while duty toward his younger brother John suddenly felt heavier. At this stage, his evolution kicks off, shifting from personal pain to detached scrutiny, as the overlooked boy quits hoping for sympathy and begins analyzing society realistically, dramatic, fiercely contested, delicate, and entirely conquerable by anyone equipped to handle intense stress. His repeated attempts to enter Sandhurst reveal that change clearly, because they show not effortless brilliance, but deliberate self-forging. The stubborn conversion of restless energy into discipline, memory, nerve, and practical ambition, all aimed toward a life where usefulness might finally earn recognition. Gaining acceptance in 1893 represented far more than an academic achievement. It was an initial triumph, demonstrating that relentless grit could breach barriers mere social status could never bypass, and that true fate often masquerades as monotonous routine, awkward setbacks, and continuous struggle. At Sandhurst, the emotional weather shifts again. For the boy who once reacted from hunger and injury now begins to observe, calculate, and plan, sensing that courage, language, image, and action might be welded into one instrument capable of carrying him beyond every schoolroom verdict. However, this upward journey lacked any real purity, since the identical discipline fortifying his determination firmly tethered his fate to colonial conflicts, while the very family legends fueling his drive severely limited his empathy, proving that remarkable achievements can easily develop alongside profound ignorance without ever recognizing the contradiction. By the end of this first act, grief has hardened into determination. Order begins to replace confusion, and Churchill emerges with his earliest philosophy that history is never warm. Power without character rots quickly, and empire can raise both defenders and warnings to mankind. During February 1895, Churchill departed Sandhurst, holding a cavalry officer rank, leaving virtually zero room for youthful naivety. A uniform fit him like inheritance, yet the world receiving him was not ceremonial, but armed, anxious, and burning at edges. Late that year, in Cuba, he entered the Spanish fight against local rebels, directly experiencing insurrection as harsh elements, choking smoke, and unpredictable shootouts. For a young officer raised on ancestral victories, insurgency ceased to be a map color and became men refusing obedience. He additionally forwarded reports to the Daily Graphic, a crucial move demonstrating that first-hand observation could easily be turned into financial profit and lasting fame. The battlefield and the column page began to collaborate, shaping a man who would fight, narrate, and market himself in one motion. Surrounding him was an aging, dignified, yet declining Spain, desperately clinging to Cuba while global dominance gradually pivoted toward the United States. That spectacle stayed with Churchill because he saw how exhausted prestige can invite replacement long before surrender is formally signed. A subsequent layover in New York added a personal dimension to this education, merging his maternal American roots with his developing tactical worldview. He was not yet preaching alliance, but he had begun to sense that Britain's future would be measured against transatlantic energy. During 1896, his cavalry regiment deployed to Bombay, where the sprawling bureaucratic apparatus of Indian governance easily replaced the fleeting combat he witnessed in Cuba. There, empire was visible in docks, mess halls, ledgers, rail lines, and the patient distance between rulers and ruled. During these months, he devoured literature intensely, intellectually fortifying himself with classic historians and debate, because mere military status could never satisfy his immense aspirations. Self-education gave him a confidence, the dangerous belief that study and will might prepare him for command before experience did. By 1897, he attached himself to a military expedition near the northwest frontier, witnessing firsthand how brutal suppression operated smoothly beneath respectable bureaucratic labels. The passes were harsh, the villages exposed, and retaliation arrived wrapped in the language of order and necessity. Fierce tribal resistance revealed a truth the empire hated acknowledging. Supposedly unshakable dominance appears extremely fragile whenever a population simply refuses to. He did not answer that challenge with humility. These conflicts ultimately solidified his belief that withdrawing breeds chaos and that supposedly advanced societies are completely justified in deploying ruthless countermeasures. That was his moral failure before it became anybody else's danger. Because prejudice learned in youth can survive into statecraft. Simultaneously, he perfected his personal formula, transforming physical danger into lasting fame through published literature, vivid storytelling, and calculated self-promotion. Editors, commanders, and family connections helped. But the essential fact was coda. He recognized visibility itself as power. After his stints in Cuba and India, the distinct personas of combatant, witness, empire loyalist, and hopeful writer seamlessly merged. What emerges is the young Churchill in outline, brave, gifted, watchful, and already carrying the hard assumptions he would later drag into larger wars. Although he would eventually champion liberty with great passion, His early training permanently embedded imperialistic notions deep within his worldview. That contradiction is the warning here. Courage can be real and still arrive, carrying blindness beside it. Returning to England during the spring of 1898, Churchill brought home battlefield grit, newspaper clippings, and the lingering emotional pain of a boy still battling his late father's legacy. London offered drawing rooms, committees, and the first true scent of Parliament. Yet peace felt airless to him, as if applause without danger could never settle the score. Jumping immediately into politics, he demonstrated quick autonomy by favoring certain liberal domestic policies, even though he continued to firmly oppose self-governance for Ireland. That tension mattered because it revealed a rising public figure already trying to join popular politics to a rigid belief in imperial unity. Combat stayed his most effective tool, since military deployments allowed someone to forge a public name rapidly beneath the unforgiving pressure of actual physical danger. So when the Sudan campaign opened a path to distinction, he chose motion over comfort, binding private ambition to Britain's drive for mastery in northeastern Africa. Pushing up the Nile wasn't some trivial operation, but a crucial piece of a grand colonial blueprint connecting Egyptian dominance, UK military goals, and the broader scramble for African territory. By securing a place with Kitchener's expedition in 1898, Churchill inserted himself into one of the century's clearest demonstrations of organized industrial empire. Heading south, he served simultaneously as a cavalryman and a Morning Post journalist, proving his early refusal to experience major events without immediately shaping their public narrative. That double identity was historically important because he was learning that modern power belonged not only to generals who conquered events, but to writers who fixed their meaning. Initially, the military campaign appeared mathematically precise, seamlessly combining UK leadership, Egyptian troops, riverboats, railway development, heavy cannons, and Maxim machine guns into a single, perfectly coordinated juggernaut. To an ambitious young officer, such a force seemed to promise the old rewards of courage, honor, visibility, and an opening into serious statecraft. However, as he marched deeper into Sudan, the adventure's glamour faded entirely, and the harsh realities of territorial takeover quickly overshadowed any sanitized talk about moral. The Mahdish state had ruled much of Sudan since the upheavals of the 1880s, and its resistance reminded him that empire did not advance into emptiness. The force marched through militarized cultures, actively protecting their faith, leadership, and heritage, meaning every new colonial boundary essentially overwrote another population's valid claim to sovereignty. On the September 1898, near Omdurman, outside Khartoum, the British-Egyptian army of about 25,000 shattered a Sudanese force more than twice its size. Advanced machinery dictated the massacre's magnitude as cannons, rifles, automated weapons, and precise shooting quickly transformed a smaller troop size into an absolutely devastating combat edge. Churchill joined the 21st Lancers in the famous charge, but what remained with him afterward was not pageantry, only the sight of courage meeting machinery and losing. The battlefield revealed a society praising its own organization while simultaneously dealing out death so systematically that it completely shattered warfare's traditional romantic illusions. In letters and later prose, he condemned the killing of wounded enemies and noted the harder indifference shown toward Egyptian and Sudanese lives within the expeditionary system. Furthermore, he criticized Kitchener exceptionally harshly, condemning both the general's explosive mood and the broader lack of accountability that winning routinely grants to triumphant military leaders. Here, the young adventurer became something colder and more dangerous, a witness willing to criticize authority when conscience and ambition suddenly pointed in the same direction. His rigorous reading habits underpinned this critique, since his time in India offered him countless hours to absorb Plato, Darwin, Macaulay, and, most importantly, Gibbon. Gibbon taught him that great powers are not destroyed only by enemies, but also by vanity, moral laziness, and the habit of confusing success with right. Consequently, writing evolved beyond a mere side project to his adventures. It became his core strategy for fighting obscurity and framing events historically before anyone else could oversimplify them. The story of the Malacan field force had already proved he could turn frontier warfare into authorship, income, and public advancement. Even his short fiction, Savrola, exposed a thinker captivated not by romantic plots but by insurrection, raw authority, and the fundamental fragility of politically stressed regimes. Sudan gave him the larger form he needed, because eyewitness reporting could now be fused with history, strategy, criticism, and the psychology of empire. Upon its 899 publication, The River War offered far more than a simple battlefield diary, actively situating the territorial reclamation within the complex political and tactical framework that enabled it. He left the Nile more famous, more eloquent, and more historically self-aware. Having converted experience into authority before ever holding high office. The underlying takeaway was incredibly harsh. Violent might can rapidly forge empires, but wise leadership ultimately dictates whether those triumphs endure or merely become cautionary historical tales. He had crossed a threshold from shock into observation, from observation into determination, and from determination into a philosophy both brilliant and compromised, seeing imperial violence clearly without yet renouncing it. Following his electoral defeat at Oldham during July 1899, Churchill experienced immense claustrophobia. Within that stagnant political environment, South Africa suddenly appeared as his true calling, offering the thrilling rush of mortal peril instead of the tedious grind of gradual political advancement. He took a contract with the Morning Post. As war opened between Britain and the Boer republics in October 1899, because he already understood that modern fame belonged to the man who could both witness events and write them into national memory. The conflict possessed far profounder catalysts than his personal career goals, since the hostilities erupted over Boer territorial independence. Massive gold deposits discovered along the Witwatersrand, and the UK's unwavering resolve to absolutely dominate the continent's southern trajectory. At first, he moved through the campaign exactly as he had imagined, half correspondent and half volunteer, carrying notebooks beside courage, convinced that if he stood close enough to gunfire, he could turn electoral embarrassment into something harder, cleaner, and nationally undeniable. Ultimately, the harsh terrain fought back as highly mobile Boer fighters utilized railway sabotage, rapid maneuvers, and phenomenal sniping to humiliate arrogant British expectations, proving that theoretical imperial supremacy easily dissolves into shattered metal and terrified men upon entering rugged enemy territory. On 15 November 1899, during the armored train incident near Chieveley, the script nearly collapsed because the aspiring maker of legend was captured and carried to Pretoria, where iron bars and waiting stripped glamour away from will. Imprisonment held no heroic glamour. It was freezing, monotonous, and deeply degrading. For someone fueled by constant action, confinement posed a much worse threat than enemy gunfire. The frightening prospect that human events might simply march forward without him. What followed was audacity in its purest Churchillian form, as he escaped the State Model School in Pretoria in December, slipped through enemy territory, and reached Lourenço Marques in Portuguese East Africa, after days of concealment and nerve. England immediately embraced this tale, since his breakout provided exactly what the struggling conflict desperately required: a thrilling rescue saga. Furthermore, Churchill realized with remarkable sharpness that captivating storytelling could elevate a career far quicker than any official government appointment. He returned to the British side, not as a forgotten prisoner, but as a celebrity in khaki, rejoining operations around the relief of Ladysmith and then moving north with the advance that entered Pretoria in June 1900. He compiled his military experiences into Ian Hamilton's March, presenting the book to citizens as proof of his. He recognized that to successfully govern a nation, modern politicians needed to come across as genuinely battle-hardened rather than just smooth talkers. Yet the larger war offered no clean triumph, for Boer resistance hardened into guerrilla struggle, while British policy moved toward farm burnings and concentration camps for civilians. A brutal descent, revealing how quickly imperial righteousness could become administrative cruelty. He departed the front lines before experiencing the conflict's most brutal realities firsthand. This timeline proved crucial, allowing his pristine reputation to secure Oldham in 1900, even though genuine insight trailed behind the cheering crowds, leaving tough moral issues completely unanswered. South Africa therefore became both ladder and warning, the place where Churchill proved that ordeal could be converted into office, yet also the place where history whispered its colder lesson: that brilliance under fire does not absolve the violence that lights the stage. Combat returned him to England amid spectacular media coverage, but the focus now zooms inward, moving past decorations and cheers to reveal the strict personal routines sustaining this youthful star's relentless momentum despite immense stress. In South Africa, he traveled with wine, scotch, and brandy. And that detail matters because drink in his life was never mere decoration, but part of the apparatus of work, recovery, and performance. The shocking aspect isn't his heavy alcohol consumption, but rather his highly systematic approach. He carefully spaced his drinks out daily, a routine that apparently stabilized his incredible productivity instead of destroying his overall performance. Whiskey and soda in the morning, alcohol at lunch, more at dinner, then brandy at night formed a ritual that coexisted with writing, reading, travel, campaigning, and relentless self-advancement. At this point, intense combat trauma transitions into calm analysis, since Churchill was already figuring out how to conquer stress, not through inner peace, but by transforming stimulants, routines, and raw determination into a functional personal system. That pattern would become historically significant, since the man who later bore national catastrophe was already proving, in youth, an astonishing capacity to turn appetite into fuel without openly surrendering to collapse. Upon returning to England, his backdrop transforms from dirt and combat into train stations, political auditoriums, and the dense, chilly mood surrounding the nationwide October 1900 voting season. He stood again for Oldham, after narrowly missing the seat in 1899, refusing to let defeat harden into identity. And that refusal is the first clear sign of determination replacing injury. The schedule worked to his advantage as Lord Salisbury's administration campaigned on the nationalistic fervour of the Boer conflict, praying that surging colonial pride would firmly reinforce Tory political dominance. Churchill arrived with exactly the currency that age was beginning to reward: a face the public knew, a story the newspapers had amplified, and a reputation already burnished by danger. but the 25-year-old politician, his personal story, and colonial expansion temporarily aligned perfectly. The very conflict that revealed England's brutal imperialism simultaneously granted him the undeniable credibility of a battle-hardened national figure. He won the seat and entered Westminster. But the victory did not dissolve tension. It merely carried him into a chamber where obedience was expected from men far less independent than he was. He entered office as a Tory, albeit an awkward fit. Almost immediately, his familiar itch for action resurfaced, now significantly amplified because the legislative chamber provided a much grander platform than any military expedition. The real antagonist was not one rival across the aisle, but the hard architecture of party identity in Edwardian Britain, where tariff reform, imperial confidence, and discipline pressed members toward predictable loyalties. Regarding commerce, his natural leanings were already shifting away from growing Tory tariffs and moving toward open markets, a stance countless liberals considered absolutely crucial for England's economic success and global influence. That mattered because it showed his imagination moving beyond tribal attachment, searching for a broader political footing, even while he still wore the colors of his original side. His internal conflict was far more severe, since he craved career progression without staying quiet and desired power without yielding to authority. Typically, the riskiest possible. Many beginners survived by caution, but Churchill preferred display, risk, and the belief that originality itself could generate power if spoken with enough force and timing. His debut address during February 1901 made this rebelliousness glaringly obvious as he bluntly stated that had he been born a Boer, he would enthusiastically take up arms against the English army. The line shocked many listeners, not because it was disloyal in any simple sense, but because it revealed a young war hero trying to honor courage even when it resisted his own empire. At this exact juncture, mere observation solidifies into a far more cynical worldview, as Churchill started actively distinguishing his profound patriotism from mindless support for every single action the British government took. He did not renounce empire, and that fact must remain clear. Yet he started testing a political method that joined national loyalty to criticism of national blindness. This complexity made him an uncomfortable fit among fellow conservatives, but highly fascinating to outsiders, particularly veteran liberals who spotted not reliability but sheer drive, sharp intellect, and a highly weaponizable erraticism. Among them, and early personal ties would later help redirect the course of his career. The legislature instantly resolved one major issue by offering the grand stage he always craved. An arena where spoken words alone wielded the tremendous power previously generated by military reports, published memoirs, and frontline gossip. He no longer needed war alone to rise, because the House of Commons now allowed him to perform courage in another register through argument, interruption, and the shaping of public judgment. He achieved success not by softening his personality, but by making conflict his brand, merging his youth, celebrity, rhetorical power, and scandalous nature into a presence veterans simply couldn't disregard. Britain itself was entering unstable years of party realignment, labor politics, and imperial strain. And Churchill's temperament, so often troublesome in peace, proved unusually suited to unsettled times. Still, an early red flag lurked beneath his rise. His alcohol consumption revealed that his outward self-control heavily depended on constantly restraining his intense private urges. He was not yet visibly damaged by alcohol, but the larger truth had announced itself, that immense gifts in Churchill often traveled beside immense appetites, each strengthening and endangering the other. This era ended looking toward the future, since the 1900 vote introduced the Labour Representation Committee. A tight yet completely bound to drastically transform the UK's political landscape. So he entered Westminster young, brilliant, difficult to contain, managing turbulence within himself while the century gathered turbulence around him, and history had begun to test whether contradiction might become instrument rather than ruin. Within Parliament, Churchill noticed that strict partisan loyalty might drain a politician completely, leaving behind nothing except obedience to leadership. His quarrels with Salisbury's Conservatives over military spending, South Africa, and Ireland showed that obedience and conviction were pulling apart. The Edwardian era was actively changing due to colonial pressures, societal improvements, and trade anxieties, rendering traditional political categories incredibly fragile. Churchill read that fracture early from insight, vanity, and a cold instinct for self-preservation. He briefly considered merging the Liberal and Tory factions, a highly unrealistic idea that nonetheless highlighted just how fractured he considered the current political landscape. In Parliament, dissent became fortune, because visibility could harden into influence if a young man timed his rebellions well. Once political bosses indicated Oldham wouldn't nominate him again, he embraced that rejection as a direct invitation to pivot. The decisive act came in May 1904, when he crossed the floor to the Liberals and wagered his future on free trade and reform. Tories labelled him a traitor, while several Liberals eyed him suspiciously as an imperialist climber wearing fake camouflage. They were not entirely wrong to doubt him, because ambition in Churchill was never accessory, it was engine. However, this shift carried immense historical weight, positioning him within the exact political faction that championed his initial welfare reforms and cabinet ascension. South Africa still smouldered in memory. Ireland still exposed the Union's instability, and every argument seemed to touch the nerves of empire. He craved authority, but refused to sacrifice his identity, finding negotiation somewhat helpful, even though total obedience felt absolutely unacceptable. In calmer men, such a temperament might have ruined a career. But in Churchill, it produced a method: survive, reposition, advance. Getting married transformed his personal atmosphere far more profoundly than any public address ever could. When he married Clementine Hosier at St. Margaret's, Westminster, on 12 September 1908, he gained not an ornament, but an intellectual partner with steadier judgment than his own. Clementine could comfort him, scold him, and effortlessly diffuse the perilous spark between hurt feelings and reckless reactions. Their union rested on affection and respect, a quieter fact than scandal, but far more durable. Amid high society's calculated marriages, their union offered a remarkable rarity, an intimate confidant who genuinely grasped both his public theatrics and their hidden personal price. Children followed, and the household turned ambition outward into inheritance, binding his name to lives more vulnerable than reputation. Diana, Randolph, Sarah, Marigold, and Mary made family legacy a physical reality during meals, rather than something merely envisioned through daydreams or written memoirs. Marigold's death from septicemia in 1921 would later tear through that happiness and remind him that public strength never cancelled private exposure. Purchasing Chartwell in 1922 provided the family a true sanctuary rather than a mere showpiece. Its masonry, ponds, and isolation offered much-needed peace from his constantly combative career. So he emerged with a new party, a durable marriage, and a warning history keeps repeating. Intimate loyalties may preserve the very statesman whose choices later endanger mankind. The massive January 1906 Liberal victory thrust Winston Churchill into a much tougher political battlefield, where industrial pollution, public riots, and brutal electoral math easily shattered traditional upper-class arrogance. He had crossed the floor in May 1904, and the gamble now seemed less theatrical than surgical. A young politician, cutting himself free from a party discredited by tariff division and stale certainties. Initially appointed to the Colonial Office by Henry Campbell Bannerman, the ex-cavalry officer quickly realized that endless jobless lines and intense worker resentment could damage the nation just as lethally as enemy gunfire. What shocked him was not poverty alone, but the scale of it. The sight of modern Britain generating wealth, soot, fatigue, and resentment in the same breath, as if prosperity itself carried a hidden crack. Once Herbert Asquith took the Prime Minister's office in 1908. Churchill secured the presidency of the Board of Trade, effectively positioning him alongside David Lloyd George at the progressive forefront of the Liberal administration. The new battlefield had no charging horses, only memoranda, railway disputes, shipping questions, arbitration files, and the blunt statistics of men drifting between short wages and no wages. Here, his raw ambition matured into calculated strategy, realizing that if authorities only addressed working-class anger using cops and lectures, the UK would merely secure temporary peace while steadily destroying its own underlying credibility. He saw the real enemy less as one rival party than as poverty, insecurity, and mutual caste distrust. Structural pressures capable of making constitutional government appear ornamental and morally exhausted. Consequently, Churchill hunted for highly pragmatic rather than overly emotional solutions, heavily favoring solid bureaucracy, regulatory committees, and strict legislation over meaningless words of compassion that utterly failed to fill empty stomachs. The mines. 8 hours. Act of 1908 reduced the working day underground, a small clause on paper, yet a grave admission that profit could become a slow The 1909 Labor Exchanges Act aimed to organize the chaotic job market, connecting the unemployed with available positions before their hopelessness could sour into violent political anger and total societal alienation. Alongside Lloyd George and other reforming liberals, Churchill helped widen the state's meaning, presenting government not only as tax collector, jailer, or imperial guardian, but as a mediator in industrial life. This held significance far beyond mere political gains. Widespread strikes, Labour's post-1906 surge, and severe European turmoil clearly warned Edwardian England that completely unmitigated capitalism would inevitably spawn far more brutal ideology. Yet reform did not wash away suspicion, and many workers still saw in Churchill an aristocratic opportunist, brilliant enough to diagnose injustice, but never fully trusted to welcome democracy in its full demand. By February 1910, taking over as Home Secretary, he transitioned from welfare reforms to the government's harsh enforcement sectors, observing jails, law enforcement, immigration, and civil harmony from a strictly detached bureaucratic perspective. The transition exposed a darker lesson, that reform and repression were neighboring rooms in liberal governance, and a minister might pass from one to the other without noticing the moral temperature change. Although he displayed a certain willingness toward women voting, his stance remained guarded and restricted, unable to fully shed aristocratic prejudices that dreaded broadening liberties just as fiercely as they championed national strength. By then, the transformation was unmistakable, from reckless young seeker of glory to planner of systems, though the old danger remained, because his will to preserve Britain still outran his trust in mass politics. Consequently, his initial prominent roles provided an enduring caution. Governments postponing fairness invite rebellion, and driven leaders who mishandle civil turmoil might damage a country just as profoundly as an actual armed conflict. In October 1911, Winston Churchill entered the Admiralty as First Lord, a civilian gripping the oak rail of Britain's maritime survival. Inside bustling government rooms smelling of documents, wax, and Kenshin, he took charge of the naval armada, securing provisions, commerce, communications, India, and imperial swagger. He arrived from domestic reform into a colder chamber, where memoranda about dreadnoughts and oil fuel already sounded like weather reports before catastrophe. His deep craving for action found fulfillment in the maritime branch, since preparedness was quantifiable, technological progress tangible, and hesitation He pushed gunnery, reserves, communications, and the shift from coal toward oil, studying machinery with the appetite of a man racing time itself. However, while he strategized against German threats, the domestic front experienced severe anxiety, as the prospect of Irish self-governance risked deeply dividing citizen allegiances nationwide. Churchill backed Home Rule and opposed partition, only to watch Ulster resistance reveal how quickly constitutional language can harden into armed suspicion. Outside the British Isles, naval friction with Berlin, colonial disputes, and Balkan volatility transformed the continent into a militarized arena. fueled by arrogance and severe blunders. He understood the burden clearly. Think like a cabinet minister in Dublin and like a wartime executive in the June 28, 1914, brought Franz Ferdinand's assassination in Sarajevo, suddenly shifting the overall geopolitical atmosphere from mere debate directly to a rapidly ticking clock. While many still hoped diplomacy might hold, Churchill pressed precaution, knowing that invisible administrative hours often decide whether nations improvise or survive. He kept the naval armada consolidated and fully prepared, ensuring the nation's primary defenses weren't caught off guard when hostilities finally erupted that August. That steadiness was not solitary genius, but cooperation among Asquith, Edward Grey, naval professionals, signals rooms, dockyards, and drill routines. The maritime forces were positioned to secure the English Channel, safeguard military deployments into France, defend commercial shipping lanes, and enforce a stricter embargo. This was success in the bleakest sense, because efficient preparation did not spare Europe from ruin, only gave Britain a harder endurance. He reinforced their primary defenses, yet this preparation merely facilitated entry into mechanized carnage, where massive casualties were dictated by artillery, starvation, and endless bureaucratic administration. The lesson entered him like cold water. Foresight can preserve a state, but it cannot cure the vanity, fear, and rivalry beneath war. Poised on the brink of immense renown and harsher criticism, he realized that readiness requires ethical effort, yet it completely fails to provide true ethical salvation. By the winter of 1914, Winston Churchill stood in Whitehall as the minister who had readied the fleet. Yet readiness was not enough for his temperament. Looking past the bleak massacres throughout Flanders, he completely rejected the notion that the continent's fate had to be settled purely by battlefield grime and staggering casualty statistics. That refusal carried danger, because imagination in wartime can save nations or seduce them into disasters dressed as originality, craving dynamic offensives over mere survival. He saw the Dardanelles as a slender gateway leading straight toward a vastly expanded theater of conflict. If the straits could be forced, he believed, Constantinople might be shaken, Ottoman resistance broken, and Russia relieved through a reopened sea route. It perfectly matched his preferred style: subtle, settle, theatrical, maritime, and globally sweeping, serving as a brilliant tactician solution against the overwhelmingly fatal grind of static frontline engagements. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he pressed harder than more cautious men, and in cabinet government pressure often becomes policy before doubt fully wakes. Cartographically, the strategy appeared remarkably refined, a watery passage triggering massive geopolitical disruption, widespread political shifts, and potentially a rapid improvement in the coalition's overall prospects. In reality, the Dardanelles were a hard throat of water, mined, fortified, narrow, and guarded by Ottoman defenders who knew every ridge and current. At this juncture, he encountered a persistent trap for political leaders, the alluring urge to mistake highly idealized concepts for realistically achievable goals. The Ottoman Empire had entered the war beside Germany, threatening Russia in the Caucasus, and stretching Allied anxieties across the Eastern Mediterranean. While this ensured the objective was genuine rather than completely imaginary, having a legitimate goal never guarantees sufficient logistical readiness. In March 1915, the naval assault failed to force the straits, and the sea itself seemed to turn stern, cold, and judicial. Underwater explosives, heavy artillery, and widespread chaos ruined the campaign's potential, proving that sheer bravery is practically useless against poorly analyzed battlefield environments. What might have ended as a failed naval attempt then widened into something far heavier. A landing campaign on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Forces hailing from Britain, France, India, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand plunged into the effort, turning a clever tactical blueprint into an agonizing multinational nightmare. When the landings began in April 1915, men came ashore into rifle fire, broken ground, scrub, cliffs, and defenders holding the heights. The actual beachhead delivered a harsh judgment. After losing initial momentum, dynamic tactics rapidly deteriorated into static dugouts, extreme vulnerability, dehydration, swarming bugs, and continuous assaults. Churchill had imagined mobility, restoring war to motion, yet Gallipoli hardened into another prison of earth, blood, and waiting. Turkish pushback proved highly organized and relentless, bolstered by competent commanders, rugged topography, and the powerful psychological edge of protecting native soil. Among those defenders, Mustafa Kemal emerged with a force of will that would echo far beyond the peninsula and into the making of modern Turkey. Back in London, he continually sought a turnaround by dispatching reinforcements, since driven administrations usually attempt to offset massive losses by sinking even more resources into the fight. That decision deepened the tragedy. For persistence inside a flawed design multiplies graves faster than it restores purpose. He hadn't been the sole backer, as Asquith and fellow officials had approved the mission, yet criticism inevitably surrounds the figure whose drive brought it to life. Month after month, the peninsula swallowed strength, while the central objective remained untouched and the war elsewhere kept burning without relief. Close to 500,000 coalition forces were deployed during the operation, and over 50,000 of them perished, while countless others were injured or devastated by illness. The numbers tell only part of it, because Gallipoli was also heat, stench, dysentery, fear, and the intimate exhaustion of men pinned beneath command decisions made far. Late in 1915, the ambitious plan deteriorated into a tighter obligation, withdrawing without letting the loss become a massive slaughter. The evacuation, carried out between December 1915 and January 1916, was managed with remarkable skill and spared many lives that chaos would have consumed. This represented a rather grim form of victory. A tidy conclusion to a For Churchill, the punishment was immediate, because in the coalition crisis of 1915, he was removed from the Admiralty and left politically humiliated. Gallipoli showed him that brilliant ideas mean nothing when geography, supply lines, hostile endurance, and operational friction matter less than sheer determination. It remains a warning to mankind that modern states can take one gifted man's audacity, feed it with empire, and lay the result across beaches crowded with the dead. Still, the narrative doesn't end quietly, as the leader devastated by Gallipoli took its harsh takeaways with him, and time would eventually reveal if that defeat had refined his bravery or simply damaged it. After Gallipoli, Churchill did not defend himself from a bench. In January 1916, he went to France to command a battalion. There, disgrace felt different, since filth, rodents, and artillery fire erased the ego of someone who had foolishly trusted in sheer genius. He shared dugouts with clerks, miners, and farm boys, learning how national policy arrived at the trench as cold, noise, and fear. Narrowly surviving hostile fire reinforced his view that headgear, sheltering, and practical safety measures were essential duties instead of minor bureaucratic details. What London had treated as paperwork, France revealed as a contract between the state and men marked for sacrifice. Once back in Parliament, his tone echoed the harshness of the trenches, granting his cautions an extraordinary level of believability. The Dardanelles Commission in 1917 did not absolve the disaster, but it eased the claim that he alone had caused it. Valuing competence over a spotless record, David Lloyd George reappointed him to the administration in July 1917 as the munitions chief. The post offered no romance, only shell quotas, transport delays, chemical bottlenecks, and strikes that could silence guns across the Channel. He now recognized exactly how a factory shutdown in Birmingham could cost soldiers their lives in Flanders before dawn. He bargained, pressured, and organized, trying to keep labor conflicts from spreading into industrial paralysis at the worst hour of the war. The job lacked glamour. But by 1917 and 1918, modern survival relied entirely on fuel, metal, chemicals, train lines, public backing, and transatlantic cooperation. Britain held because that machinery held, while blockade and scarcity steadily hollowed Germany and its allies from within. In this role, he adjusted his prior mindset, realizing that societies aren't rescued purely through brilliant ideas or legendary cavalry assaults. They endure through anonymous labor, disciplined transport, negotiated compromise, and the stubborn refusal of a society to stop working. The November 1918 victory seemed less like a glorious celebration and more like weary persistence, simply outliving rival powers that had exhausted their resources. His reputation revives there, rebuilt by competence rather than brilliance. Though the beaches of Gallipoli remained behind the conflict finished, yet he adopted a harsher worldview. While people glorify brave individuals, actually staying alive requires highly structured perseverance. Industry, not spectacle, had restored him. Fighting ceased in November 1918. Yet he entered the post-war era as though stepping into a ruined terminal packed with smog, sorrow, starvation, and unresolved grudges. Victory had returned him to power under David Lloyd George as Secretary of State for War and Air, where demobilization itself became a test of whether order could survive exhaustion. Countless troops needed to be released, moved, compensated, and reintegrated into everyday society before their initial relief soured into resentment, chaos, and a risky longing for coordinated warfare. Gallipoli had chastened him, but it had not cooled his instinct to meet crisis with forceful direction. Paperwork turned into action, and action turned into personal responsibility. Positioned at the turning point between conflict and recovery, he stopped rushing toward fights, and instead figured out how much military force to maintain across a completely devastated Europe. Churchill looked across Germany and saw not only a defeated enemy, but a society that might be driven into anarchy if the victors mistook punishment for settlement. He supported keeping a robust coalition footprint inside Germany, but cautioned against a treaty so punishing that the country might turn chaotic, hopeless, and vulnerable to radical uprisings. The caution was real because the old map had burst apart, and the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires had left behind splintered frontiers and armed ambitions. Out of all emerging threats, the communist movement captured his focus entirely, not as a temporary foreign crisis, but as an aggressive ideology thriving on societal breakdown, exhaustion, and economic resentment. He spoke of it with a nearly apocalyptic severity. And that emotional intensity mattered. Because ministers do not merely describe threats, they fund, arm, and therefore he aggressively pushed for backing the anti-communist factions, linking the nation's reputation to meddling in the Russian internal conflict, which involved the grim Arctic deployments near Archangel and Murmansk. Snow, distance, disease, and confusion stripped romance from the enterprise, while the anti-Bolshevik cause proved divided, often repressive, and unable to command durable legitimacy across the lands it claimed. His anger energized national policy, but failed to achieve control, since the Russian uprising was firmly rooted in societal breakdown, military devastation, and the total collapse of the prior regime. From that failure came one of Churchill's sharpest post-war conclusions, that Germany, however dangerous, might someday serve as a barrier against Soviet expansion rather than Europe's central menace. This wasn't compassion, but rather pure tactical detachment. A sweeping geopolitical assessment where entire populations functioned like playing pieces on a board already scarred by starvation and brutality. The same mind that feared punitive excess in Europe could become brutally permissive at the imperial edge, where Arab provinces were treated less as nations than as roots, oil, and airfields. Following the Ottoman Empire's defeat, England and France established regional mandates, leaving Churchill to manage a system founded on control, force, and strictly limited pledges to the native populations. Iraq exposed the structure most clearly, because British rule there rested on thin administration, RAF pressure, and the assumption that distant authority could master resentments. It barely As the 1920 rebellion swept through Iraq and neighboring Kurdish territories, Churchill responded with imperial pragmatism, showing zero tolerance for uprisings and believing strict resolve was kinder than indecision. He even approved discussion of gas against what he called uncivilized tribes, a phrase that reveals how quickly strategic language could empty colonized people of equal moral standing. Widespread chemical warfare never materialized, not due to a sudden moral awakening, but rather because supply chain issues, logistics, and practical barriers blocked the plan before basic decency did. Here, the contradiction stands in hard light: strategic foresight in Europe beside moral blindness in empire, prudence for Germany beside ruthless. Churchill emerges from this period as neither a savior nor a cartoonish villain, but rather a leader molded by tragedy into watchfulness, which forged a ruthlessness that drove lasting post-war decisions. The warning to mankind is severe, because the fall of empires does not create peace by itself, and gifted ministers can widen violence when fear begins speaking the language of order. Following World War I, Churchill approached the Irish conflict, remembering earlier discussions about home rule, harboring a sincere distaste for using simple division as a lasting solution to the problem. Yet by 1920, the argument had left Westminster libraries and moved into alleys, barracks, and burned storefronts, where the IRA's guerrilla campaign challenged British sovereignty street by street. He clearly recognized the reality. Catholic nationalist resentment was profound. Ulster Unionist anxiety had transformed into structured political might, and peaceful legal negotiations were rapidly giving way to widespread violence. That was the first inner break in him, when moderation gave way to cold administrative thinking, because he feared that retreat before ambush and assassination would echo across the empire. Britain still held paths to peace, but retaliatory strikes restricted them, and the government's approach took a much bleaker turn once the Black and Tans mobilized in 1920. Their record of burnings, beatings, and killings did more than punish suspects. It showed the world an imperial government, borrowing the habits of the lawless. Churchill's shortcomings were primarily ethical rather than tactical. By permitting such brutal tactics, he ultimately tarnished the very governmental legitimacy he was attempting to protect. He also understood, sooner than some colleagues, that terror could not recover obedience once loyalty had broken at parish, town, and county level. What started as a policing issue had morphed into a fundamental fight for independence, and brute force could only damage Ireland without re-establishing British credibility. So when exhaustion opened a narrow door, Churchill stepped through it with the same intensity he had once brought to coercion. The July 1921 ceasefire provided a necessary pause, and during the talks leading to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, he proved to be a tough, meticulous, and absolutely vital negotiator. The settlement created the Irish Free State as a dominion, while confirming that Northern Ireland could remain within the United Kingdom. a compromise built for necessity. While this resolved the immediate conflict, dividing the country created lasting resentment. Proving governments typically accept political truths only after brute force leaves unforgettable scars on entire populations. In February 1921, Churchill entered the colonial office with Europe victorious, the Ottoman map broken, and Britain's conscience already shadowed by the cost of possession. He took over Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine, not as blank slates, but as populated conflicts where wartime pledges, Arab uprisings, and colonial directives clashed in the desert sand. To him, the task thus looked solvable. Cut garrisons, reduce expense, and govern through selected local rulers who could wear authority. This defined his post-war transition from combat trauma to calculated strategy, sustaining the empire through strict budgets, flight paths, financial aid, and the use of surrogate forces. At the Cairo Conference in March 1921, he backed Faisal in Iraq and Abdullah in Transjordan, composing kingdoms from crisis with a map-maker's confidence and strategist's haste. This setup relieved short-term tensions while dictating political destinies from the top down, showing how major nations frequently mistake hasty improvisation for lasting peace once the shooting temporarily stops. Palestine was harder because two national hopes were advancing under one flag. Arab fears of dispossession sharpened even as Zionists held Britain to the Balfour Pledge. Then the bloody May 1921. Jaffa uprisings erupted, leaving dozens dead and hundreds injured, instantly replacing political theories with actual casualties, widespread terror, locked and deep suspicion. Churchill toured the region soon after, speaking of fairness, yet the ground beneath him was already teaching a harsher lesson. Balance proclaimed from above is not balance below. His 1922 policy document attempted to scale back earlier commitments, supporting a Jewish homeland, while explicitly rejecting the idea of turning all of Palestine into a Jewish nation. It was a lawyerly rescue of an overextended imperial commitment, disciplined in language, cautious in tone, and unable to satisfy communities measuring each sentence against danger. However, any real progress was minimal, because these territories only functioned as long as English military might, funding, and reputation could prop up populations they couldn't entirely control. Churchill showed formidable mastery of detail here, but also his old blindness, trusting design more than consent, order more than sovereignty, and postponement more than peace. The 1922 Chanak crisis revived painful memories of Gallipoli, tearing the political alliance apart and driving him toward an election loss shortly after he reconfigured the Middle East. He left office with a harder philosophy. Empires may still impose structure on chaos. During late 1924, Winston Churchill firmly picked his political allegiance with a resolute finality, thoroughly believing that the Liberal Party had turned into a relic of the past instead of a powerful tool for the rapidly approaching future. The first Labour government persuaded him that class politics would now govern Britain's future, and that hesitation might let parliamentary reform slide toward bitterness, militancy, and a Soviet-flavoured example he deeply feared. Consequently, he aligned with the Conservative Party again, and after the October 29, 1924, vote crushed Ramsay MacDonald's administration, Baldwin's triumph, combined with Churchill's Epping victory, quickly installed him at the Treasury. He treated the office not as an accountant's corner, but as a command post from which national credit, public discipline, and the bruised dignity of Britain might be restored together. Theoretically, the environment was promising. London's financial sector remained influential. Colonial commerce kept flowing, and the British pound lingered in public memory as the sturdy anchor of a global economy. But post-war Britain was colder than its symbols, burdened by debts, weakened exports, idle industry, and foreign competition that bit into coal, steel, and textiles with patient, Churchill considered inflation and sloppy spending as dangers not just to commerce, but to the government's core integrity. Virtually ethical lapses that might undermine its credibility with lenders, financial backers, and everyday people. That belief helped drive his great decision in 1925, when Treasury orthodoxy and Bank of England Governor Montague Norman urged him back to the gold standard at the old pre-war parity. John Maynard Keynes cautioned that reverting would inflate the pound's value, harm export markets, and worsen joblessness. Yet Churchill favored tradition, status, and the serious weight of established norms instead of playing it safe. For a brief moment, the decision looked magnificent from Whitehall, because Britain could declare that wartime suspension was finished and sterling had been fastened once more to gold. To government insiders, this felt like healing. After disaster, the empire stood taller, accounts balanced, and the traditional rhythm of economic integrity echoed once more beneath the chaotic buzz of post-war instability. Yet the cost moved outward into mining towns, foundries, and docks, where falling prices and rigid costs pressed industries already too weak to absorb another blow without cutting wages or work. Churchill wanted the country to adapt to the money through frugality, self-control, and perseverance. This strict philosophy stemmed from his conviction that citizens, much like troops, grow tougher when enduring organized, collective struggles. Supporters in the city and conservative ranks called that sound money and civilized government. But the approval of elites could not cancel the strain, gathering in homes where unemployment, debt, and wage conflict thickened the air. When the 1926 general strike broke out, Churchill realized a difficult truth without fully embracing it. A nation might regain its outward prestige long before it heals the everyday people who support its burden. When he left the Treasury in 1929, his reputation still stood. Yet, history kept the stone a verdict, and decisions made for prestige can preserve appearances while quietly preparing a wider social reckoning. Following the May 1929 election, the former Chancellor was firmly shut out of leadership. Winston Churchill found himself sidelined, watching the nation debate joblessness, finance, and economic bounce back without the commanding presence he once brought to those crucial discussions. That exclusion cut deeper than office, because he had built his life around action. And when the Wall Street crash of October 1929 spread fear across markets and homes, he was forced to watch national danger through the glass of political isolation. The Labour Party took control, emergency administrations formed, and post-1931 leaders asserted they represented everyone while keeping Churchill sidelined. This demonstrated that top officials still heavily doubted his decision-making, even as the country's traditional economy fell apart completely. He kept epping and kept speaking, but a common seat without ministerial authority was a half-light, the condition of being visible to all and summoned by none, which, for a man of his appetite, felt like amputation. He intimately understood depression, dubbing it the Black Dog. This description matters because it wasn't poetic sadness, but total bloom, which he combated through writing, editing, structured habits, and relentless effort instead of giving up entirely. Writing became the one territory under his command, the only field where memory, argument, and ambition still obeyed him, and he returned to it like a man building scaffolding around his mind before inward weather could pull the structure down. This writing wasn't mere decoration. Books acted as his backup army, rescuing him from debt, shame, and political damage. While sidelined, authorship provided an alternative leadership role, allowing him to influence how the nation viewed past conflicts and assessed future dangers. The world crisis, whose volume appeared in 1931, reopened the First World War. Not as memory, but as a chamber of bad judgment, exhausted cabinets, wounded vanity, and overconfidence. and Churchill moved through those pages as participant, witness, defendant, and prosecutor together. This underlying fiction made his writing powerful. He didn't pretend to be completely objective. Instead, he revealed the internal experience of disaster. When politicians make blind choices, justify them later, yet still burden their countries with massive mistakes that are simply unforgivable. Shut out of office, he repurposed. Failure instead of denying it, refusing the smaller death of silence. And that decision preserved in life an alternative voice founded less on patronage than on memory, study, accumulated evidence, and sheer unwillingness to disappear. Next, he explored his genealogy by starting Marlborough, his life and times. Leadership, perseverance, and national survival against major European threats. Page by page, he reconstructed the age of Louis XIV with detail, moving armies, treaties, courts, egos, and weather across the reader's sightline until the past felt cold to the touch. And in doing so, he trained himself to narrate danger on a vast scale. Writing these books replenished his wealth, which was crucial given his lavish lifestyle. The work gave him a way to stay nationally relevant, even when the mainstream political establishment completely dismissed him as a problematic has-been. Readers recognized the achievement, and later, admirers such as Leo Strauss would rank the Marlborough Study among the century's major historical works. Proof that Churchill had regained cultural authority in years when parliamentary reward remained conspicuously withheld. A highly practical skill was developing beneath that fame. Authorship taught him to organize messy events into narrative into strong beliefs, and beliefs into memorable words that citizens could heavily rely on whenever the government appeared weak, exhausted, and confused. So, the wilderness ceased to be humiliation and became preparation. The chamber where shock hardened into observation and determination into a philosophy that nations are rarely saved by systems alone once the systems begin doubting themselves. Approaching the late 1930s, Churchill remained excluded from power. However, isolation, writing, and reflection transformed him into a sharper, more essential figure. A crisis leader simply waiting for Europe to demonstrate that he had accurately predicted the upcoming catastrophe in time. After office slipped away, Churchill returned to India as if to a map lit by storm. Convinced the Raj measured Britain's nerve and fate. By the early 1930s, constitutional overhauls became deeply real. Since India's push for rights, Britain's sheer exhaustion, and the massive empire finally collided. Labour ministers, cautious conservatives, and seasoned administrators spoke of dominion status and wider self-rule as the least dangerous road forward for Westminster and Delhi alike. Churchill sensed a bleaker truth. Yielding was just the beginning. An initial fracture in the barrier, he thought, secured Ireland, the Middle East, and India. From the opposition benches, under green lamps and the dry rustle of papers, he turned Parliament into a last defensive trench. At that point, status, history, and damaged confidence combined, as his public remarks attempted to frame colonial stalling as strict control instead of sheer cowardice. By then, however, many British officials had already concluded that the Raj could not survive unchanged without deeper Indian participation. Churchill outright rejected this assessment, and his intense disdain for Gandhi highlighted the sheer short-sightedness of confusing legitimate independence with simple treason. India had outgrown paternal language. Universities, legislatures, newspapers, and Congress networks had taught millions to imagine politics beyond obedience. However, he consistently claimed that independence must be delayed until the Indian people met specific criteria solely established by the British government. That was his moral failure, because prudence hardened into subordination and guardianship became a polished word for command without consent. Stubborn colonialists praised his stamina, yet their cheers originated from a rapidly fading faction, obsessed with tradition and terrified of chaos. In December 1934, he voted against the India Bill. Yet the larger movement continued and reached law in the Government of India, Act 1935. Consequently, his triumph was purely symbolic. He became the fiercest critic of change, while actual progress marched right past the government's doors. Here, the warning darkens, because Churchill could detect danger in imperial retreat, yet not in domination, the deeper injury already poisoning loyalty. Regarding India, he appears focused yet lessened. An expert alarmist who failed to embrace true fairness across the colonies before the next major European crisis. In January 1933, when Adolf Hitler entered the chancellorship by legal appointment, Churchill felt the old European floorboards creak beneath polished constitutional language. Having watched nations bluff, administrations wander, and preventative measures crumble in 1914, he easily spotted a recognizable ruthlessness within this latest German uprising. After the Reichstag fire and the destruction of civil liberties, he understood that legality was being used as a ladder to dictatorship. That April, he addressed Parliament about Germany's horrifying situation, pointing out ethical decay before most would even acknowledge the obvious military. That clarity came from trauma refined into observation, the habit of a wounded politician who now read menace by its texture, pace, and appetite. Britain still possessed factories, shipbuilders, funding, and a government ample power to respond. Yet the nation acted sluggishly, like someone guarding an old wound. Peace marches, budget caution, and memories of the Somme made delay sound humane, even as Berlin rebuilt force under flags, speeches, and uniforms. Churchill viewed Germany's military buildup with immense dread for their air force, knowing bombers could rapidly transform indecision into incinerated neighborhoods. Yet the warning voice was damaged. Goods, burdened by his campaign against Indian self-government, and by colleagues who mistook foresight for obsession. Unable to dictate official strategy, he relentlessly argued his case, utilizing plane statistics, manufacturing delays, and military preparation documents as ammunition. A few ministers, officials, and journalists listened, not enough to govern, but enough to keep the truth from sinking completely below fashionable optimism. Consequently, this time frame offered no major victories, just the grim achievement of documenting his alarms while the government actively ignored reality. There is something nearly tragic in that image, one man outside office, measuring the storm correctly while doors of power stayed latched. His previous mistakes made him perceptive, but reduced his political power, proving that personal history can clarify events without actually offering salvation. By the mid-1930s, he remained unheard by many, but already history was hardening him for the hour when denial would finally break. During the mid-1930s, the UK still struggled with the trauma of World War I, and this deep tiredness blanketed the government, acting like a blinding haze that many confused for carefulness. Churchill, stranded outside office, watched ministers treat delay as wisdom, and the loneliness of his position gave his warnings a harsh credibility that power itself might have diluted. Throughout Europe, Mussolini made fascism seem effective to his supporters, while Soviet horrors and the upcoming Spanish Civil War made many British citizens far more afraid of communism than the Nazi threat. Churchill saw earlier than most that this ranking of dangers was ruinous, because every statesman who treated Hitler as a bulwark against revolution also granted him time, dignity, and room to arm. For many prominent individuals, making concessions initially seemed refined, rather than weak. A strategy of meetings and careful compromises that could save families from another wave of casualties. Britain was climbing out of depression. Industry was uneven. Memory was raw. And so, moderation, but a national temperament that congratulated itself while Germany rebuilt strength. In this climate, Churchill emerged as a bothersome truth-teller, utilizing speeches, writings, and memos to argue that the Nazis weren't just a normal administration with minor complaints, but a radical group determined to conquer more territory. He spoke with the sharpened instincts of a man bruised by earlier battles. Yet his own record on India and empire left many colleagues determined to hear obsession, where there was, in fact, diagnosis. The devastating part wasn't that the UK lacked functional systems. Parliament debated openly. Papers published opposing views, and colonial connections continuously sent data and witness accounts back to the capital. Churchill believed facts, if spoken without anesthesia, could still discipline fear, and that belief turned his isolation into labor as he gathered aircraft figures, intelligence fragments, and strategic warnings with almost prosecutorial force. However, the UK's political environment praised comforting news over future planning, and many respected leaders preferred believing Germany only wanted to tweak the Versailles Treaty, instead of violently overhauling Europe. His struggle was therefore against temperament as much as policy, against class confidence, diplomatic habit, and the soothing old instinct that danger postponed might somehow become danger diminished. Following David Lloyd George's 1936 trip to Germany, where he left admiring Hitler's seeming vigor and the country's revival, Churchill spotted something more chilling than mere error. Power's dark allure during an era terrified of frailty. He understood that tyranny often first appears to the tired as order, and that uniforms, motor roads, and choreographed crowds can disguise the machinery of persecution and war. During the middle of the decade, he collaborated with the anti-Nazi Council and dialed back his prior anti-Soviet rhetoric, demonstrating a pragmatic flexibility to bridge political divides whenever the primary danger necessitated such action. Yet that very flexibility revealed his predicament, because he could assemble evidence of German rearmament. But he could not force a weary establishment to feel in its nerves what he already knew in his mind. Gatherings, correspondence, banquets, and the focus network surrounding personalities like Austen Chamberlain, Robert Boothby, and Henry Page Croft sustained the alert. Yet this anxiety consistently fell short of translating into official government policy. Each month of hesitation widened the gap between Churchill's diagnosis and Britain's actual readiness, until foresight itself began to look like a form of helplessness measured in speeches rather than squadrons. Nevertheless, he tirelessly pieced together a moral alliance from the ground up, utilizing anti-fascists, anxious conservatives, bureaucrats, and spy networks to transform fragmented panic into concrete, evidence-backed leverage. This was Churchill, in one of his purest forms, denied formal authority, yet refusing passivity, constructing influence through persistence, personal networks, memory, and a stubborn command of detail others found exhausting. While his backers lacked the sheer numbers to dictate outcomes, their ethical significance lay in maintaining clear proof within British society that a few recognized the peril and steadfastly declined to appease it. That minority tradition kept a lamp burning in the constitutional dark, proving Churchill was not a solitary fantasist, only a man standing several steps ahead of the governing mood. Whatever minor headway these alerts achieved was consistently eroded by outside diversions, most noticeably during the 1936 abdication crisis, a time when a monarch's controversy entirely consumed the focus of the establishment. Churchill watched Edward VIII's determination to marry Wallis Simpson consume drawing rooms, newspapers, and calculations of prestige, while German rearmament advanced beyond the edges of fashionable conversation. This takeaway stung profoundly, illustrating that nations fall not merely to hostility or conquest, but via disastrously skewed priorities, where minor emergencies sideline lethal perils, until time fundamentally aids the enemy. When Stanley Baldwin retired in May 1937 and Neville Chamberlain entered Downing Street, appeasement gained not merely a new manager, but a prime minister who believed personal negotiation could master ideological ambition. Churchill evolved into Chamberlain's fiercest detractor, since he realized that genuine courtesy was being extended toward a government seeking not modest agreements, but rather bullying, territorial expansion, and outright conflict. What these years reveal is severe and permanent. That democracies often fail not from ignorance alone, but from the emotional price of acting on unwelcome knowledge before disaster makes hesitation look absurd. These details also expose a grim truth regarding Churchill. A leader can accurately identify their era's primary peril, yet still be hindered by personal biases, emotional scars, and prior blunders brought into the struggle. By the late 1930s, As Hitler moved faster toward territorial expansion and the revenge politics born from 1918, Churchill stood unheard by many, yet inwardly certain, a man learning that peace without resistance had become only the long road to war. The continent didn't accidentally blunder into conflict. Adolf Hitler carefully calculated and probed the situation, deducing from the feeble reactions to his military buildup that the British and French dreaded a second massacre, far more than they worried about a tyrant discovering his own boundaries. Inside the Nazi leadership, there had once been talk that a great continental war might come later, around 1941 or 1942. Yet the timid diplomacy of the mid-1930s altered the clock, because each concession taught Hitler that boldness brought reward before his enemies had fully armed themselves. Tensions escalated sharply during March 1938, as Austria fell not through fair diplomatic discussion, but via bullying, domestic subversion, and armed German forces looming at the border, ultimately framing the Anschluss as a homecoming while independence was openly murdered by brute force. In Vienna, the cheering crowds, the swastika banners, and the ecstatic theater of union fed Hitler's oldest dream of a greater Germany. And the emotional effect on him was profound, because unpunished success hardened conviction into destiny, the most dangerous fuel a dictator can possess. Observing these developments while still haunted by the chilling recollections of 1914, Churchill addressed the House of Commons following Austria's hostile takeover, desperately attempting to make his fellow lawmakers grasp the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe, explicitly cautioning them that obliterated borders never genuinely satisfy a conqueror's growing hunger. The grim truth was that resistance was still possible, because Britain and France retained fleets, armies, industry, diplomatic reach, and the power to draw a line, while Czechoslovakia itself was no helpless victim, possessing fortifications, modern arms production, and alliances that gave deterrence real substance. However, Neville Chamberlain interpreted the developing situation strictly through a lens of compromise, acting as a pragmatist, actively seeking specific complaints to resolve via diplomacy. And this entrenched mindset, largely stemming from the horrific carnage of World War I, caused him to treat a radically dangerous government as merely having minor gripes. Hitler's next demand, the Sudetenland, was wrapped in the language of ethnic justice, a plea to protect Germans in Western Czechoslovakia. But Churchill saw the trap immediately, because once borders could be revised by threat and propaganda, every small nation in Europe stood before organized blackmail. The true disaster involved not merely a lack of awareness, but overwhelming sentiment. Millions of Britons desire peace so desperately that taking a tough stance appeared downright, while Churchill's damaged standing from prior scandals caused many to dismiss his pressing warnings as just another classic bout of hysteria. he still pushed forward, visiting Chamberlain at Downing Street and urging a harder line, even warning that if Czechoslovakia were destroyed by force, Britain might have to face war then, rather than under worse conditions later. But private access to power produced no change at the decisive hour. Shut out from government positions. Churchill deployed his sole remaining tool rhetoric, honed by past experiences, to repeatedly argue that giving up the Sudetenland would never resolve the conflict, since a tyrant acquiring land without a fight develops profound disdain rather than thankfulness for anyone who surrenders. By late September 1938, a few MPs, editors, and ordinary citizens had begun to notice that Churchill's warnings formed a pattern confirmed by events. Yet their support remained too thin to master the governing mood, and reassurance still carried more political comfort than unwelcome truth. For a single evening, the September 30, 1938, Munich Agreement appeared to calm the chaos. It achieved this by giving Czechoslovakia's frontier regions to Germany, for Hitler's word that he wouldn't demand more land. A flimsy treaty relying on faith in an individual who absolutely hated rules. No. Churchill judged Munich with bitter clarity, calling it a defeat without war, because a democracy had abandoned an ally, damaged its own honor, and taught Berlin that pressure worked. And when Germany destroyed the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, the lie at the center of appeasement cracked open before the world. Taking over Prague was harshly significant, demonstrating that Hitler wasn't simply uniting German-speaking people, but rather seizing control wherever vulnerability allowed. Only after this event did England and France speed up their military build-up, pivot toward Poland, and realize just how terribly they had misjudged his true nature. Vindication came too late to feel triumphant, because Germany invaded Poland on 1 September 1939. Britain and France declared war on the 3rd September 1939. And Churchill returned that same day as First Lord of the Admiralty, carrying old scars, hard-earned authority, and the bleak lesson that civilization can die by installments before it hears the alarm. Back at the Admiralty in September 1939, Churchill discovered a stagnant standoff instead of action. Poland was already destroyed, while the UK remained oddly quiet. The maps looked active, yet London felt muffled, as if Europe were burning behind heavy curtains and official language could keep the smoke outside. He wasn't fooled by what was eventually dubbed the phony war, having learned throughout the 1930s that lulls in Hitler's timeline never actually meant a stop to the dictator's scheming. Through that long winter, he watched ministers confuse the absence of large battles in France with the presence of strategic safety, and he judged the mistake with cold clarity. Churchill believed the actual war zone was already within the government itself, where bravery, quickness, and guts determined whether intelligence sparked real action or just became useless. Delayed paperwork. He had been ignored often enough to understand the price of delay, and that old humiliation now hardened into a severe political advantage. While some people still wished to handle the conflict carefully, he no longer thought that standard procedures could hold back such radical, aggressive expansion. Attention turned north, toward Norway, because the coastline, the ports, and the route of Swedish iron ore mattered far more than their frozen distance suggested. Churchill pushed to place explosives in Norway's seas and take aggressive action near Narvik, driven not by dramatic impatience, but by a strategic belief that naval dominance could limit Germany's options. He stood in those councils, not as a crowned savior, but as an embattled minister trying to push a slow government faster than its own instincts. The naval command was among the last remaining tools the UK could use assertively, and Churchill relied on maritime strength because it turned strategic choices into tangible reality. Warships could move, blockade, escort, strike, and warn, while speeches alone could not alter the timetable of conquest. However, every idea went through Neville Chamberlain's administration, where hesitation constantly overtook readiness and fragmented leadership, destroyed any momentum. This was more than administrative weakness, because one prime minister's temperament now influenced the pace at which a democracy answered mortal danger. Ultimately, Hitler attacked beforehand. On 9. Towns and harbours fell before UK strategies were totally ready, demonstrating that having vision without actual leadership power was useless against highly organised, aggressive action. The Allied campaign that followed, with British, French, Polish, and Norwegian forces engaged, produced brave episodes, but no strategic recovery. This defeat hit Churchill especially hard. He had clearly spotted the threat in the north, but his public image was now closely linked to that disastrous military campaign. In May, the crisis entered the House of Commons and changed from a military setback into a judgment on national leadership. When the Norway debate began on May 7, 1940, the room's atmosphere rapidly shifted from discussing a single military operation to critiquing the entire management of the conflict. Democratic states sometimes discover in debate what armies have already felt in the field: that authority can collapse before institutions formally change hands. As people condemned the Navy's readiness, Churchill refused to use bureaucratic excuses or push the fault onto lower-ranking officials and advisory boards. He stated that defects in the Royal Navy were his responsibility, and in that moment, the House saw a wartime quality still scarce in government: ownership of consequence. This difference from Chamberlain was absolutely brutal. Labour would not serve under him, Liberal support was absent, and even many Conservatives now treated party loyalty as a luxury the hour could no longer afford. Remarks by David Lloyd George were particularly damaging. The ex-wartime leader essentially declared that poor planning had morphed into a fundamental failure of leadership and morality. By 9, May Chamberlain's authority was visibly spent, and by 10 May he resigned because he could no longer form a united wartime government. On that exact day, German forces pushed westward through France and the Low Countries, linking Churchill's rise to power with the start of an incredibly bleak European battle. The timing gave his appointment an almost brutal logic, as if history had waited until every easier illusion was broken before admitting the necessary man. He didn't take office at Downing Street with a victorious celebration, but rather under the weight of looming catastrophe, facing a threatened France and a terribly isolated Great Britain. He later believed that his whole life had prepared him for this trial, and the remark reveals something stern about him, that he treated biography as training for burden. His ascension provided a very grim takeaway. Democracies often elevate the right leader only after delay has enlarged. The danger and redemption comes not through innocence, but through clear sight joined to accepted cost. Churchill took power on May 10, 1940, right as the continent fell apart around him, with German troops aggressively invading the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. He inherited not a transition, but an emergency in which delay at the top could deepen the continental disaster within hours. He quickly realized the UK's initial fight was purely mental, since panic in Parliament could trigger capitulation before an invasion even started. So he governed morale as deliberately as freets and memoranda, treating language itself as a weapon of state. By uniting Liberals, Labour and Conservatives, his joint administration framed fighting back as a patriotic obligation instead of a risky political bet. That choice widened to legitimacy at the exact moment when unity mattered more than ideological purity. Rather than providing reassurance, his initial parliamentary address on May 13 promised only grueling labour, suffering and absolute sacrifice. Its power came from severity, because he told Parliament that sacrifice was the price of survival, not the cost of some later mistake. He refused to buy temporary cheers using fake positivity, while the global situation grew more terrifying every single day. Yet compromise still tempted the political class. The UK possessed naval strength, colonial assets, and strategic flexibility. Yet some politicians believed diplomatic talks were the key to national survival. Halifax embodied that cold attraction, the belief that prudent men should at least explore terms before isolation became complete. Subsequent Nazi triumphs across France and the Low Countries made surrendering seem reasonable, causing detractors to view Churchill's rhetoric as recklessly dramatic. The internal danger was stark, whether Britain's own rulers still believed resistance meant anything after France began to crack. Dunkirk transformed that debate into a grueling trial of soldiers, naval vessels, and ticking clocks. By late May, roughly 338,000 British and Allied troops were trapped around the beaches and harbour, vulnerable to capture and political despair. Churchill understood that withdrawing meant tactical defeat, recognizing equally that faking a victory would completely shatter public confidence. Operation Dynamo rescued those forces through destroyers, merchant craft, harbour labour, RAF protection, and relentless seamanship under bombardment. While citizen watercraft became mythical, the actual operation succeeded because solid coordination withstood incredibly intense stress. On 4 June, Churchill warned the Commons that wars are not won by evacuations. This truthfulness proved crucial, as he framed their escape as a renewed duty rather than letting the evacuation justify surrendering. His vow to fight on beaches, landing grounds, fields, streets, and hills gave the nation a usable grammar for endurance. His approach succeeded by addressing the threat directly, framing bravery as strict duty rather than glorified fantasy. Around him stood ministers who would not bend, Labour figures who stabilized the coalition, and civilians beginning to feel the war required their own hands. Halifax's push for diplomacy failed because Churchill consistently reminded the government that any agreement with Hitler would cost their national independence. That refusal became one of the century's hinge decisions, preserving Britain as an armed base for the later Allied return to Western Europe. Triumphs during 1940 didn't resemble actual wins. They merely kept the country from imploding while France surrendered, and a mainland attack seemed highly likely. On 18 June, as France collapsed, he told the Commons that the coming Battle of Britain would decide whether their story ended in servitude or reached what he called their finest hour. Churchill's success was ultimately tangible, as well as psychological, since stabilized spirits directly boosted manufacturing, military recruiting, orderliness, and resilience during bombings. The lesson is severe. Free nations are sometimes saved by leaders who clarify loss instead of disguising it. He finished this period not by achieving total victory, but by ensuring the UK survived long enough to keep the future open. Britain had refused terms. Yet by autumn 1940, that decision was being tested under sirens, shattered glass, and the orange lift of London burning after dark. Churchill grasped the modern war zone with stark realism. Should everyday citizens lose their resilience, no navy, government agency, or stirring rhetoric could save the nation. The Luftwaffe came not only for docks and rail yards, but for the nervous system of a democracy, hoping terror would do what invasion had not. Inside bunkers, on train platforms, and alongside firefighters rushing into the blaze, numerous UK citizens embraced immense tragedy as the steep price for continued freedom. That acceptance did not erase fear, but Churchill's earlier refusal to flatter the public had turned sacrifice into duty, and duty into a form of national discipline. He experienced an isolation rarely felt by leaders, facing a surrendered France, an uninvolved US, and his own pleas echoing through a globe entirely unprepared to help. Britain still possessed gifts of geography and invention, radar along the coast, fighters in reserve, command of the sea, and imperial lines that kept breath in the body. Still, the margin for error was tiny. Airstrikes devastated neighborhoods, submarines severed supply lines, and every sunken fleet worsened the brutal math surrounding starvation, gas, and survival. Churchill could supply nerve, but he could not manufacture wheat, oil, escort vessels, or dollars, and he knew eloquence without materiel becomes theater. Thus, he messaged Roosevelt with calculated desperation, crafting intimate requests that framed the UK's current crisis as an inevitable American nightmare should Hitler conquer the Atlantic. Roosevelt moved carefully, constrained by Congress and isolationist opinion, yet his sympathy deepened as British sailors, pilots, and civilians kept proving that resistance was real. Once Lend-Lease launched during March 1941, provisions, fuel, and arms sailed overseas as more than mere freight. They essentially transformed borrowed time into actionable military strategy. Then, in June, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and Churchill performed one of the war's hardest acts of statecraft by aiding Stalin without forgiving Stalinism. He wasn't driven by righteousness, but by sheer magnitude, realizing that defeating the Nazi regime demanded partnerships, massive enough to endure deep ethical compromises. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the war he had carried like a private burden became unmistakably global, and relief arrived, tempered by the knowledge of greater slaughter ahead. The harsh takeaway he provided humanity during that fiery period was that society endures not by staying pure, but via resilience, flexibility, and the bravery to accept indispensable allies. In 1942, Churchill looked east and saw the map of empire catching fire from Hong Kong to Burma. America's involvement broadened the coalition. But it couldn't protect the UK from the stunning rapidity of Japan's attacks. In London, pins moved across staff charts, but in Malaya, men heard bicycles, engines, and aircraft before they saw defeat. The outdated colonial belief that sheer distance, naval might, and reputation could frighten Eastern nations was openly crumbling. Churchill fought a global war with Germany still first in his calculations, and that logic was strategically sound. It proved incredibly damaging, since every delayed transport, airplane, and leadership decision out east significantly worsened their vulnerability. Singapore had been spoken of like iron certainty, a fortress backed by guns, docks, and imperial confidence. Strategists severely underestimated Japan's preparation, speed, and aviation power, while heavily overvaluing their own prejudiced cultural stereotypes. Through the jungles of Malaya, the invader moved with a speed that made doctrine look antique. Every withdrawal stripped away the UK's facade of power, while locals watched European supremacy crumble in the dirt. On 15 February 1942, Singapore surrendered, and Churchill later called it the worst disaster in British military history. He clearly realized why, since a military force had collapsed alongside their long-standing myth of total invulnerability. The war then rode into Burma, where roads dissolved, refugees crowded the tracks. India sensed the hostile forces approaching through tropical downpours, widespread gossip, and devastating airstrikes hitting Calcutta. Britain and India had to relearn war through supply lines, air transport, disease control, and defensive depth. Rebuilding relied heavily on Indian troops, workers, and land. The exact assets. Their service altered the moral balance of the war, because necessity gave subject peoples leverage. Gandhi's Quit India campaign politicized this reality, demanding independence from an administration currently battling overseas dictatorships. Churchill resisted the language of imperial sunset, yet events were narrowing the ground beneath him. Japan's push into India was successfully halted by 1943, and the defensive front firmly held its ground. Millions had seen empire retreat in weird time, and once seen, that weakness could not be unseen. Though Churchill stood as a titan baffling fascism, his perspective on Asia seemed constrained by his generation. The hard lesson is that a statesman may save a nation and still fail to save the myth that formed him. Bengal transformed into a lingering death trap during 1943 as Calcutta's sidewalks, rural trails and train stations became packed with the starving, hollow-eyed victims of a British-administered famine. Between roughly 2 and 4 million people died, and the argument that still burns around Churchill begins here, with bodies that turned wartime administration into moral judgment. He viewed India strictly as a colonial asset to control rather than a developing equal state, a mindset that restricted his compassion well before any choices regarding aid emerged. After Japan took Burma in 1942, Bengal lost a major source of imported rice, while military planners feared invasion through the east and treated food as part of defense. Environmental disasters and economic collapse collided, as storm destruction, agricultural plagues, price spikes, stockpiling, and transit bottlenecks morphed mere shortages into a nightmare, far worse than failed crops. The so-called denial policy removed boats and rice from threatened coastal districts so the Japanese forces could not use them. Yet the province itself was left stripped and exposed. Once food costs skyrocketed past what farmers and workers could afford, the starvation shifted from theoretical data points into a visible societal breakdown marked by bloated bodies and orphaned kids. Churchill remained immense in the European war, yet here he appears in a harsher light, as an imperial manager whose instinct was to secure strategy first and explain suffering later. Alarms surfaced from local citizens, administrators, and Indian streets. Yet the vast geographical divide and Churchill's disdain for the nation's independence movement allowed him to easily dismiss these alerts. Only when the scale of death was undeniable did the War Cabinet on 24 September 1943 approve further grain shipments, a necessary act that also revealed how late recognition had become part of the crime. Defenders accurately highlight cargo deficits, the loss of Burma, combat disruptions, and domestic Indian shortcomings, proving this disaster possessed multiple driving forces, rather than resting solely on one leader's shoulders. Yet complexity is not acquittal, and about 250,000 tons of grain diverted later could restrain the famine's edge without restoring the millions already lost. English authority endured the conflict in Bengal, yet emerged permanently tarnished, since bureaucratic survival seemed meaningless compared to the haunting memories of bodies collected from local streets and public squares. In Bengal, The triumphant voice that rallied Britain sounds distant, replaced by memoranda, delayed shipping, and a governing imagination too ready to rank imperial necessity above Indian life. The most troubling lesson from Churchill's legacy remains that his tactical brilliance in fighting Hitler failed to ensure ethical treatment for the colonized populations existing under his direct authority. The dead continue to argue with his legend, leaving history with no easy verdict, only the cold fact that a leader may help save civilization in one theater while failing humanity in another. Churchill assessed the conflict through pivotal moments by 1942, instances where countries either found their footing or plunged toward annihilation. North Africa looked barren on the map, yet he saw Egypt, Suez, oil, and the empire's lifeline exposed there. Losing the Desert Campaign meant Britain would forfeit far more than territory. It would sacrifice vital access, reputation, and tactical breathing room. Rommel's advance forced him to think beyond island defense toward the wider structure holding Allied survival together. Each withdrawal amplified his fury as he understood that government officials often lose their resolve long before the frontline troops do. Then El Alamein, in October and early November 1942, gave Britain a victory hard enough to feel real. Combat offered no glamorous spectacle, consisting merely of explosives, artillery, dark soot, and soldiers navigating through metal-pierced darkness. When Montgomery broke through, Churchill understood the event instantly as political fact as much as military success. Britain demanded undeniable proof that the Nazi onslaught could be actively reversed, not just barely endured. On 10 November 1942, Churchill framed El Alamein as a beginning of reversal, not a finish line. His unique talent was transforming combat updates into profound historical significance before immense relief could devolve into lazy overconfidence. At nearly the same moment, Stalingrad was closing around the German army, and the war's atmosphere changed. Time, which once benefited Hitler, now shifted to favor Allied partnerships, factory production, and collective stamina. Churchill had waited since 1940 for exactly that shift, believing survival would eventually summon stronger allies and larger armies. Yet North Africa wasn't Germany, and he flatly refused to let victorious celebrations induce tactical complacency. Rommel still mattered, and overextension mattered more, across the Atlantic, India, Russia, and the Mediterranean. Churchill combated this immense pressure with the daily routine appearing highly chaotic, externally, yet perfectly calculated internally. He rose around 7, read in bed, dictated memoranda rapidly, and saved energy for judgment instead of ritual. His nighttime nap wasn't a luxury, but a functional tactic to stretch cognitive stamina for late-night choices. His drinking and irregular hours invited criticism. Yet they did not prevent concentration when concentration counted. Staff, politicians, military commanders, and assistants converted his flood of ideas into concrete directives, timetables, and usable legislation. That support mattered because wartime leadership is never solitary. However large, one man's shadow appears afterward. Come spring 1943, coalition troops had secured North Africa, successfully eliminating the pressing danger to Egypt's canal. Churchill read the result as confirmation that pressure on the Axis margins could produce cumulative advantage. Capturing Sicily in July 1943, then pushing into Italy, extended this tactical mindset to Europe's southern borders. These campaigns were costly and imperfect, but they forced the Axis to defend ground it once consumed. To Churchill, the Mediterranean wasn't mere scenery. It was a crucial corridor where maritime logistics, diplomacy, and empire violently intersected. Success there. Washington and Moscow, because victories shared among allies repaired. Approaching late 1943, Churchill observed the Nazi momentum fading, though he never assumed the bloodshed was nearing its conclusion. He remained surrounded by papers, fatigue, alarms, and the knowledge that Europe and Asia still demanded blood. The underlying takeaway proved both individual and practical. Success gets forged through daily routines long before making the news. History, he learned, can turn on a battle, but it is sustained by disciplined minds that do not yield to exhaustion. Churchill understood by 1944 that simply surviving meant nothing if British resilience didn't cross the Channel to liberate France. The island he had refused to surrender in 1940 now bristled with American camps, landing craft, fuel dumps, and the disciplined noise of an invasion assembling under rain and secrecy. Still, he treated Overlord not with grand speeches, but as a worried strategist. Terrified by memories of Gallipoli and nightmares of soldiers dying in the waves over a single botched tide or weather forecast. His imagination, once a spur to reckless motion, had turned colder with age, forcing him to test assumptions, question timing, and look past optimism toward catastrophe. come mid-1944, combined aviation, naval dominance, clever misdirection, and massive manufacturing made the invasion viable, proving to Churchill that coordinated democracies could assemble unstoppable power to crush oppressive regimes. On 6 June 1944, the landings succeeded, and the beaches of Normandy did not become the strategic graveyard he feared, but the hard opening through which Western Europe could be reclaimed. That specific juncture revealed a stark historical truth. His firm rejection of peace talks back in 1940 successfully safeguarded the singular staging ground, allowing American and British forces to attack Hitler across the water. Behind the headlines stood a coalition held together by shipping tables, chiefs of staff, resistance reports, and Churchill's stubborn belief that personal argument among exhausted leaders could still bend events. However, coastal victories quickly clashed with diplomatic conflicts during high-level meetings, where Stalin evaluated Europe based on Soviet troop progress rather than shared Allied values or signed treaties. At Tehran in late 1943 and Yalta in February 1945, Churchill argued for Poland, Greece, and a balance in the Balkans, already sensing that victory might free France while abandoning the While Roosevelt stayed crucial, US focus increasingly shifted toward working with the Soviets and broadly crushing Germany and Japan, forcing Churchill to realize persuasion has strict limits when the armies aren't your own. He could help open the road to Paris, but he could not secure a settlement equal to Britain's first war aim, and that limitation wounded him more deeply than public ceremony admitted. Even as celebratory bells chimed for freedom, Churchill observed Eastern Europe falling under a different regime's shadow, realizing you can win a righteous conflict while simultaneously losing the ensuing peace. D-Day therefore stands in his life as both fulfillment and warning, proof that moral defiance can save a continent, and proof that victory itself may carry the first code outline of the next conflict. Approaching the Rhine in 1945, Churchill stood on the brink of triumph while holding authorization for one of the conflict's most horrifying acts. The area bombing directive of February 1942 had already fused factories, rail yards, and workers' streets into one target map, and he accepted that logic. Memories of the Blitz, political stress, and mounting death tolls calloused his perspective until extreme destruction started looking like a brutal type of mercy. British and American bombers now crossed deep into Germany, turning aluminum, fuel, radar, and doctrine into weather made by men. Generals insisted that obliterating transit, destroying homes, and shattering enemy resolve would conclude the conflict sooner, preventing further infantry casualties across Europe. Churchill, who had watched London burn, believed speed itself was a weapon, because delay might leave fanatic resistance going among ruins. From February 13 to 15, 1945, approximately 1,300 coalition aircraft unleashed almost 4,000 tons of heavy munitions and firebombs all over the municipality. A firestorm followed, oxygen banished from centers, streets became furnaces, and about 25,000 people died amid collapsing stone, glass, and lungs. Despite its military connections, the town's renowned artistic heritage made the resulting inferno feel profoundly unjust even then. The strategic case was not empty, because rail links and communications mattered to Germany, yet certainty had begun to outrun evidence. With Germany already collapsing everywhere, every fresh round of devastation appeared far more like vindictive retaliation than actual tactical necessity. Here, Churchill's tragedy sharpens, because a leader who helped save Europe also consented to methods that scarred liberation itself. Following mounting backlash, he attempted to restrict future airstrikes strictly to tactical objectives. But memory was already permanent. Supporters answered with the facts of the hour that Germany still fought, Allied casualties mounted, and no cabinet commands wore from hindsight. While that justification carries merit, it fails to erase the grim reality that absolute warfare conditions even essential leaders to completely overlook human suffering. The Third Reich collapsed in May. No guerrilla miracle saved it, and the bombing ended only because the enemy was gone. Thus, the era concludes with a tainted triumph, leaving Churchill victorious against Hitler, but shadowed by his reliance on devastation. Dresden remains his grave reminder that conscience can survive inside power and still arrive too late for the buried. Following June 6, 1944, Churchill observed coalition forces pushing back into France, providing undeniable evidence that his solitary defiance in 1940 wasn't mere posturing, but a tangible manifestation of practical belief. Yet victory carried an emptier sound than defiance, because saving Britain required nerve, while shaping the peace demanded arithmetic, restraint, and an answer to imperial exhaustion. Heading into late 1944, German forces faced annihilation from the east, west, and Italy, while December's Ardennes offensive merely demonstrated just how lethal a collapsing government could still be. That gamble failed, and Churchill read its failure with the cold attention of an old survivor, seeing again that tyranny can look strongest just before its structure gives way. During early 1945, his focus transitioned from combat charts to diplomatic meetings, where the newly suggested United Nations briefly appeared as a mechanism capable of recalling the lessons Europe had discarded. He wanted more than ceremony from it, because a statesman who had lived through 1914 and 1939 no longer trusted eloquence, unless institutions and force stood behind it. The Double Coalition briefly appeared stable, prompting Churchill to desperately leverage this deteriorating cooperation to shield minor countries, especially Poland, from a brutally compromised post-war settlement. But Soviet armies already stood across Poland, Hungary, and the eastern half of Europe, turning every phrase about self-determination into a test of who actually held the ground. As Russian forces besieged Berlin in April 1945, Churchill sensed one conflict concluding while another dawned. Realizing Hitler's downfall occurred entirely too late to salvage Eastern European liberty. Hitler killed himself. On 30 April 1945, Germany surrendered on 8 May, and the vow Churchill had spoken through bomb smoke and isolation was finally redeemed in public fact. Next arrived the harsher realization. While Britain endured, its status as a global superpower had vanished, now relying entirely upon American finances, a fracturing empire, and widespread combat exhaustion. Churchill believed, not irrationally, that triumph would carry authority into peacetime politics. Yet millions of voters were already thinking less about Dunkirk than about rent, work, health, and security. By scheduling the general election for July 6, 1945, he misjudged the country's mindset, mistakenly expecting that public thankfulness would act like political loyalty and secure his post-war governance. His campaign sometimes sounded antiquated, and his warning that Labour might need coercive controls landed badly in the country that had endured real coercion under sirens, ration books, and graves. Headed by Clement Attlee and bolstered by Beveridge's blueprint for public assistance, the Labour Party presented an alternative post-war future grounded in rebuilding rather than dwelling on history. The public listened, and beneath the cheers for Churchill moved an ode of grievance, the memory of interwar unemployment, caste hardness, and conservative failure, now sharpened by hope for a fairer peace. Well before Japan capitulated following the atomic bombings of August 6 and August 9, 1945. British voters had already determined that achieving overseas victories differed entirely from fixing domestic society. So when the delayed results were declared on 26 July 1945, Labour won a landslide, and the man who had steadied Britain in emergency walked out of Downing Street defeated. This reflected harsh democratic reality rather than ungratefulness, proving citizens can respect wartime bravery while prioritizing homes, healthcare, paychecks, and basic respect over simple adoration for a leader. Churchill felt the blow personally, because the victory he had carried like a burden seemed unable to translate itself into ordinary consent, that colder currency of parliamentary power. Losing the election didn't finish his political career, and as an opposition leader, he quickly cautioned that Europe's solidifying post-war reality contained the initial icy grip of the Cold War. His story closed this chapter with a warning to democracies. Churchill departed Downing Street in July 1945, not as an exhausted figure, but as a triumphant military leader unexpectedly deprived of power. A cheer still followed him, yet defeat cut deeply, because public gratitude had not preserved political power for a single season. This unexpected blow shifted his rhetoric. Outside office, freed from cabinet restraint, he could say with colder precision what victory had failed to secure. During the Tehran and Yalta conferences alongside Roosevelt and Stalin, he observed paper agreements weakly combating the overwhelming reality of military occupation. By 1946, he no longer believed paper promises could protect a continent already entered by occupation, police power, and fear. While ceremonial charts showed a freed continent, a new authoritarian system was settling over the devastation in Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans. Ballots narrowed, opponents disappeared, newspapers bent, and the language of anti-fascist security began hardening into one-party rule. Churchill easily recognized this trend, since he had spent decades observing how superpowers justify oppression as essential. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophically against Hitler, and Stalin could present control as a shield against future invasion. Identifying this threat proved difficult, since it emerged coped in triumph, collective sacrifice, and the ethical goodwill earned by countless casualties. Britain, meanwhile, was exhausted, indebted, rationed, and still scattered across imperial commitments it could no longer carry with ease. Churchill fully grasped this grim calculus. Indignation by itself would not move. Soviet divisions back across the ground won in 1944. However, he realized inaction stems from rhetoric, occurring whenever isolated incidents get dismissed as regional flukes rather than pieces of a unified strategy. So he turned to the oldest instrument he trusted, the public sentence sharpened until it could function like strategy. During early 1946, he toured America, still projecting the legendary mystique forged throughout Britain's most desperate wartime moments. Americans heard not merely a retired politician, but the man whose refusal in 1940 had kept open the road back to Europe. Standing alongside President Harry Truman at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri on March 5, 1946, Churchill took a bold rhetorical gamble. He said that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain had descended across the continent. Although he didn't invent the expression, his delivery transformed it into a geographic blueprint, a stark caution and a rallying cry. Suddenly Poland divided Germany, occupied Austria, Balkan turmoil and pressure across Eastern Europe formed one intelligible crisis. He wasn't demanding an instant military conflict. He was arguing for vigilance, Anglo-American cooperation, military strength, and the moral refusal to confuse silence with peace. The address resolved no immediate practical issues, yet it transformed public awareness, which is exactly how foreign policy initially develops its spine. Many critics called him inflammatory, even reckless, as if naming the fracture might be more dangerous than the fracture itself. Subsequent global developments quickly validated his assessment. The tightening of Soviet control in Eastern Europe, the crises over Greece, Turkey and Berlin, and the building of rival alliances gave institutional shape to his alarm. Viewed from that perspective, Fulton represented a darkly successful milestone. Churchill, denied office at home, had still hoped the West see the next age before it admitted its own name. The veteran commander appeared as something rarer than a mere conqueror, an elderly watchman observing post-war joy sour into bitter polarization. His emotional journey had hardened from wartime exaltation into post-war sobriety, from belief into disciplined suspicion, from memory into resolve. He realized that humanity might outlast one dictatorship only to wander, partially relieved and deeply oblivious, right into an entirely new authoritarian nightmare. That is the lasting warning in the speech. Global events continue unfolding after combat ceases, and democratic nations suffer severe consequences whenever they confuse collective fatigue with genuine security. July 1945 left Churchill outside Downing Street, hearing victory bells fade into election arithmetic and learning that war glory could not govern peace. He remained the Conservative chief, bruised yet active, channeling personal sting into organized resistance as the UK navigated economic hardship, lost territories, and frosty geopolitical tensions. The old habits of command now met queues, ration books, housing shortages, and voters who wanted welfare state guarantees more than battlefield thunder. Internationally, though, his reputation retained its electrifying 1940 intensity, with overseas listeners recognizing the unyielding resilience of embattled free nations within his speeches. That stature let him speak beyond party skirmishes, as if defeat at home had stripped him down to larger arguments about civilization, empire, and Europe. India revealed his most profound blind spot, since Churchill fiercely resisted its sovereignty, worrying a rushed imperial withdrawal would spark massive sectarian slaughter and governmental collapse. After his government had already accepted that imperial rule could not last, and history moved faster than Churchill's conviction that guardianship preserved order. The 1947 partition ultimately birthed India and Pakistan amid widespread displacement, slaughter, and horror, granting his grim predictions a devastatingly accurate historical legacy. Yet the warning was incomplete, because he could foresee slaughter without surrendering the paternal creed that had long justified British dominion. Regarding India, his brilliance hit a wall, and the visionary who once defined an era discovered he could no longer control its trajectory. He showed more suppleness over Ireland, hoping partition might someday yield to consent, because coerced settlements leave grievances sleeping beneath law. Addressing Zurich on September 19, 1946, he championed a united European brotherhood, looking past the devastation to make continental forgiveness seem completely logical. He could not build the institutions himself, but he helped make Franco-German cooperation imaginable, giving moral language to Europe's reconstruction. Nearing the 1950s, British strength faded, its overseas territories fractured, and Churchill remained in the shadows as a living artifact and the vigilant watchman. From opposition, he learned a coda philosophy that accurate prophecy is not enough when loyalty to the past narrows justice. During October 1951, an almost 77-year-old Churchill returned to Downing Street, acting as an aging warrior, stepping up for obligation rather than glory. The camera should linger on the face, fuller, heavier, lined by fatigue and cigars, yet still lit by appetite for command. The surrounding country felt far droomier than the post-war era, characterized by food coupons, financial liabilities, deteriorating infrastructure, and exhausted tolerance. After his narrow majority after the 1950 election had made Parliament brittle, and Churchill understood that endurance can outweigh brilliance. Hoping for political security by scheduling a 1951 election, Attlee unintentionally invited back the exact rival fate refused to put out to pasture. This return was not the thunder of 1940, but the quieter strain of a veteran trying to govern decline without surrendering dignity. He reclaimed leadership over a weakened country, heavily reliant on US influence and tormented by the grim reality of its shrinking empire. His body, too, had become part of the story because age turned each cabinet paper into a contest with time itself. Citizens were finished with heroic rhetoric. They simply desired housing, stocked grocery aisles, winter heating fuel, and the total elimination of waiting lines. That demand exposed the hard truth of peacetime government. Symbolic greatness can steady a people, but cannot alone stock a kitchen. Consequently, Churchill relied on his peers, making Harold Macmillan's residential construction initiative a prime indicator of the new administration's practical value. Rationing eased, ordinary life thawed, and the second premiership found success not in drama, but in restored routine. However, his genuine passion continued to be international relations, believing that high-level diplomatic meetings could stop the globe from solidifying into permanent divisions. But the deeper victory of these years came through language, the instrument he had sharpened across battlefields, cabinets, and midnight broadcasts. The 1953 Nobel Prize in Literature acknowledged more than mere eloquence. It celebrated historical storytelling and powerful rhetoric deployed to safeguard fundamental ethical ideals. That mattered because Churchill had always fought on two fronts, first to influence events, then to seize their meaning before others could. Rarely has a leader seamlessly blended political authority with writing, demonstrating that impactful rhetoric can outlive an administration while expanding its broader influence. So this chapter ends not in youthful assent, but in stern, late-season proof that endurance, if disciplined, can delay oblivion. He leaves it revitalized and honored, visibly approaching the unavoidable boundary all conquerors face, where accomplishments endure but aging offers absolutely no compromises. In the autumn light of the 1950s, Churchill no longer moved like the cavalry officer of his youth. Yet the instinct to seize history had not left him. Returning to power post-1951, he continuously released autobiographies, addresses, and essays, acting as though a political career simply wasn't expansive enough for the colossal legacy he planned to leave behind. He had learned through war and parliament that power fades quickly, that phrasing can outlast cabinets, and so he turned from command toward authorship with cold deliberation. Realizing countries forge their identities through language, Churchill fully intended to dictate how the UK, imperialism, and collective perseverance would be discussed long after the actual participants passed away. In 1953, the Nobel Prize in Literature confirmed that ambition, honoring not his premiership alone, but the prose record through which he narrated conflict, character, and statecraft. He skipped traveling to Sweden personally, a noticeable absence that brought a unique melancholy, since his legendary booming voice was currently trapped inside a rapidly deteriorating physical form. Around him, senior conservatives expected an orderly transfer to Anthony Eden, the kind of controlled succession an old governing elite preferred to imagine as natural and civilized. However, transitioning leadership lacked grace, since Eden's medical condition remained shaky, and Churchill struggled to surrender the immense power he had dedicated his entire existence to securing. The real enemy was no opposition leader across the Commons, but time, secrecy, exhaustion, and the slow revolt of age within the flesh itself. He experienced a severe stroke, causing brief immobility in June 1953, spending months rehabilitating at his private estate while citizens were deliberately fed heavily sanitized updates regarding his actual condition. That concealment revealed something hard about mid-century government, where stability could still be treated as a paternal right greater than transparency. Churchill hoped rehabilitation would return his capabilities and pride, but moving into 1955, his mere struggle to continue clearly proved his political tenure had outlasted his actual stamina. So, in April 1955, he resigned. And the act mattered because departure, too, can be a form of statesmanship when delay threatens to turn reverence into danger. Queen Elizabeth II awarded him a knighthood, but he rejected a dukedom, embracing formal pageantry while deliberately declining to establish a fresh aristocratic dynasty under his name. He then returned more fully to the written realm, publishing between 1956 and 1958 the 4 volumes of A. History of the English-Speaking Peoples. At that point, the elderly statesman pursued closure through storytelling rather than politics, weaving freedom, tradition, combat, and caution into one final profound thesis regarding society. His final lesson was grave and human. A leader may master crisis and still lose. He exited his leadership role, physically drained yet legendarily famous, remaining deeply entangled in ongoing debates concerning imperialism, remembrance, liberty, and the overall purpose of historical narratives. After April 1955, Churchill left Downing Street, but not the stage, keeping his Commons seat as Britain moved from imperial certainty into a leaner age, haunted by his voice. Surrounded by masonry, paintings, documents, and guests at his estate, his authoritative leadership transitioned into reflective assessment, allowing the former commander to evaluate global affairs from the sidelines with quiet rigor. Age altered him into something colder and stranger, less a maker of policy than a human monument. A father of the house whose presence made parliamentary ceremony feel tied to survival. He wrote, painted, vacationed alongside Clementine, and hosted diplomats at his country home, though polite gatherings couldn't mask the UK's shrinking global influence or its rapidly fading empire. Across the late 1950s, colonies moved toward independence in wave after wave, and Churchill watched assumptions formed in cavalry messes, cabinet rooms, and wartime maps lose their grip. The 1956 Suez debacle inflicted the most profound damage. After Nasser seized the waterway and Allied forces attacked Egypt, the mandatory retreat driven by US, Soviet, and UN demands brutally highlighted Britain's undeniable geopolitical decline. Churchill saw the humiliation clearly and criticized Anthony Eden in private. But diagnosis was no longer command, the new wound of old age. His physical health ultimately gave out as strokes, extreme fatigue, and a hip fractured from a 1962 tumble in Monte Carlo turned the formerly dynamic man into a clearly frail figure. Even so, the world kept saluting what he had represented. And in 1963, Kennedy made him an honorary citizen of the United States, confirming the Atlantic bond Churchill had long championed. This distinction held significant weight, since it elevated his legacy past partisan politics and imperialism, cementing his place in broader democratic history shaped by rhetoric, partnerships, and the legacy of 1940. In 1964, when he chose not to stand again after 64 years in Parliament, the House of Commons answered with a special resolution of thanks, treating retirement as an era closing. He embraced his retirement without theatrics, and this self-control served as his ultimate display of discipline, safeguarding his honor while saving Parliament from witnessing a legend defeated by aging. What remained was not executive power, but authorship, memory, and a grim lesson that greatness is tested not only by crisis, but by how a leader endures irrelevance, contraction, reversal, and judgment. A severe stroke hit him on January 10, 1965, and on January 24, precisely 70 years following his father's passing. Yet conflicted regarding his legacy. His last years offer no easy benediction, only warning and truth, that one life can defend a nation magnificently, yet still stand as witness to the passing of the world it fought to save. January 1965 thrust Winston Churchill back into the nation's spotlight, no longer as a commanding orator in Parliament, but as a casket in a parade, forcing citizens to weigh his actual humanity against the massive myth he forged. For 3 days he lay in state at Westminster Hall, where queues of mourners turned private death into public reckoning, and where empire, democracy, sacrifice, and error stood in the same winter hush. Held on January 30th, 1965, his state funeral marked the first for a commoner since William Gladstone's in 1898, demonstrating that Churchill's wartime decisions had transcended partisan politics and embedded themselves deeply into British national identity. Queen Elizabeth II attended at St. Paul's Cathedral, a rare gesture toward a former Prime Minister, acknowledging that his decisions had touched not merely ministries and elections, but the continuity of the state under mortal threat. While the artillery wagon rolled across London, citizens remembered the defiant leader whose 1940 addresses transformed belief into collective stamina, proving to terrified everyday people that brave rhetoric could function as an actual shield for the nation. He was remembered first, and rightly, as the leader who refused accommodation with Hitler when Britain stood alone, because hesitation at the summit might have darkened the fate of Europe and its persecuted peoples. However, the ceremony also provoked more difficult reflections, since Churchill's character was forged in Sudan, India, and South Africa, where colonial conflicts instilled harsh military discipline while permanently linking his worldview to imperial conquest. In Parliament, he could be magnificent against tyranny and stubborn against reform, often reading democratic unrest, Irish nationalism, or Indian self-rule as symptoms of disintegration, rather than claims with their own moral authority. Gallipoli stood as his most devastating cautionary tale, proving that traits like drive, foresight, and urgency, while great during emergencies, turn deadly whenever unchecked arrogance leads to thousands dying over a reckless tactical bet. What made Churchill formidable also made him dangerous, because greatness and blindness lived in the same mind, each drawing strength from the same appetite for command, certainty, and historical scale. Setbacks never sidelined him for long, and this crucial tenacity meant the politician who weathered mockery, job loss, and loneliness emerged as one of the few British officials to spot the Nazi threat well before his peers. He also fought mortality with prose, producing memoir, biography, and history on a vast scale, until the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953 confirmed that he shaped events not only through office, but through memory. Following St. Paul's, his voyage along the Thames and interment at Blaydon near Blenheim Palace connected his noble upbringing with his legendary status, accompanied by troops, admirers, foreign partners, lawmakers, and everyday grieving citizens. The route formed a map of British meaning: Westminster for state, St. Paul's for consecration, the river for wartime memory, and Blaydon for ancestry, as if the nation were placing Churchill among its guardians without pretending he belonged to a simple tradition. Upon his burial, the complete catalogue of his existence lay bare: combatant, colonial observer, lawmaker, cabinet official, wartime commander, Cold War prophet, scholar, and award-winning author, with every single role shaping the 20th century while adding profound complexity to his legacy. His funeral closed the life, but not the argument, because Churchill saved a free nation from fascist defeat while carrying assumptions about empire and hierarchy that the modern world could no longer forgive or entirely escape. Churchill's casket paraded across London in January 1965, but the fierce debates regarding his legacy never subsided, as Europe continually questions the true character of its savior. Seen from a distance, his life looks like granite under stormlight. One figure amid imperial retreat, mechanized slaughter, parliamentary strain, and the desperate summer of 1940. No truthful history can diminish his immense significance, since he operated at the heart of Britain's worst emergencies and permanently impacted governments, overseas territories, combat zones, and the preservation of democracy. But significance is not innocence, and the greater his authority became, the wider the circle of people exposed to his judgments, vanities, and mistakes. The controversy originates in Sudan, South Africa, and India, where Churchill started viewing imperialism as an obligation, a dramatic stage, a hazard, and a perfectly valid tool for forceful subjugation. He did not enter greatness as a neutral conscience, but as an imperial statesman shaped by cavalry discipline, aristocratic memory, and the governing habits of caste. However, his legacy defies simple stereotyping, since this same individual championed open commerce, supported female voting rights, and occasionally pursued middle ground when far more stubborn politicians demanded absolute inflexibility. That complexity matters, for his mind was restless rather than still, capable of revision without ever fully escaping the severe assumptions that formed it. His most profound asset was vivid historical foresight, honed by ego, anxiety, and relentless energy, allowing him to detect looming disasters long before more relaxed peers even acknowledged the warning signs. He grasped earlier than many that Hitler threatened more than territory, because Nazism meant the wreck of law, conscience, and Europe's political soul. During May 1940, amidst France's rapid collapse and looming invasion threats, Churchill flatly refused any peace talks with Nazi Germany, firmly locking Britain into a path of unyielding defiance. His speeches were not decoration in that hour, but instruments, stiffening ministers, parliament, and civilians when national psychology might still have broken. As he talked about shores, hard work, and resistance, his phrasing seemed forged, instead of elegant, providing structure to terror and form to mass hysteria. Yet the verdict darkens when the camera leaves Britain and returns to imperial subjects who met Churchill not as saviour, but as ruler. He backed brutal military crackdowns throughout Ireland's fight for independence, and during the early 20s, he actually considered deploying chemical weapons to crush Middle Eastern uprisings. Toward Indian nationalism, he was often contemptuous, treating Gandhi and Congress less as founders of a future state than as agents of imperial collapse. This dread intertwined personal and political motives, as imperial collapse jeopardized the UK's global standing, and his deeply ingrained conviction that stability demanded British dominance. The Bengal famine of 1943 remains the sharpest wound, where wartime priorities, shipping choices, administrative failure, and Churchill's language still provoke charges of indifference. Academics argue over exact causes and proportions, yet the charge sticks because it questions if his strict priorities caused him to casually disregard certain populations. Failure also enters the ledger at Gallipoli, where imagination outran preparation and thousands paid for a strategic gamble shaped by urgency and overconfidence. While fearless, he also acted rashly, driving situations through sheer charisma when strategy, scheduling, and careful waiting demanded a calculated restraint he often failed to maintain. Still, the story refuses simplicity because Churchill sometimes urged magnanimity after war, warning that humiliation stored up revenge and future violence. As an author and scholar, he accomplished something far rarer than leadership, molding lived events into lasting literature to warn future societies about democracy's extreme vulnerability. The Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953 recognized that language, in his hands, was not ornament to power, but one of its instruments. Ultimately, his reputation relies upon a deeply unsettling hypothetical scenario. Without an undefeated Britain, there is no secure Western base for return, and Soviet power might have reached far deeper into post-war Europe. Even numerous detractors acknowledge the crucial reality that his stubborn determination throughout 1940 and 1941 kept the dream of a free Western Europe alive. The grave lesson is that greatness and blindness can inhabit one life together, and judgment becomes dishonest when it keeps only one side. Though Churchill bravely shielded freedom from fascism, he simultaneously harbored colonial prejudices that deeply harmed subjugated populations, forcing history to acknowledge both complex realities at once. So the ending remains unsettled. because he stands as both Britain's greatest war leader and one of its most troubling imperial sons.